Awesome. Thank you so much. It gives me such great pleasure to welcome our final plenary speaker for our conference, Dr. Jessica ChenFeng. So I first met Jessica a few years ago when we were both working on the School of Medicine with their physician formation curriculum. I actually, I'm going to say working loosely because I actually had a pretty peripheral role, but Jessica had a very central role in that. But I remember even from our few meetings just being very impressed with your composure, your thoughtful demeanor, your approach to really difficult questions, especially in the face of angst and anxiety that was shown by our medical students. And so hearing your thoughts was really helpful. And then a few months ago, just having the pleasure of hearing you along with the team describe the physician formation curriculum for the School of Medicine, and hearing how students are guided through self-reflection and self-care literally brought tears to my eyes. One of the reasons why we thought this was so important into a conference like this is solidarity is hard work. Accompaniment is hard work. And how do we prepare ourselves in order to do this kind of important work that we do? I just want to give you a brief introduction into Dr. ChenFeng's many accomplishments. Sorry, let me just grab the... Dr. ChenFeng is an associate professor of marriage and family therapy at Fuller Theological Seminary. She's been a practicing marriage and family therapist for 18 years in California. She consults with academic, healthcare, and religious organizations to improve the well-being of people within their communities. Her research and clinical work center around the social-contextual intersections of race, gender, generation, trauma, and spirituality. And in the last few years, her primary clinical focus has been the well-being of physicians, especially through pandemic-related trauma and burnout. Jessica has been shaped by multi-denominational faith contexts. She's grateful for the ways that these traditions have shaped the contours and depths of her Christian faith. Much of her joy, growth, and inspiration comes through life with her family, her husband, and her 2 young children, and her extended first and second generation Taiwanese American family. So please join me as we welcome Dr. Jessica ChenFeng.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wee. Such a delight to be back on one of my favorite campuses and seeing faces that I dearly love. As Dr. Wee mentioned, for about 4 or 5 years, I was working in the Office of Physician Vitality along Barbara Hernandez, serving our physicians here. And so some of this presentation is connected to that work, but it's connected to a larger breadth of research and clinical experience I've had for the last almost 2 decades. All right. Okay. I need to use this. Okay. All right. I wanted to just briefly mention, so much of, and I think when we have calling, right, when you feel called into the work that you do, your research and your clinical work is very personal. And so the work that I do, what we'll talk about today, it's things that are not just professional to me, but they're part of my personal life. And as people who've heard me lecture many times, people will know that I share some personal stories. Some of you may know Parker Palmer's writings. I deeply appreciate his writings, and this is a quotation from his book, Let Your Life Speak. Our deepest calling is to grow into our own authentic selfhood, whether or not it conforms to some image of who we ought to be. As we do so, we will not only find the joy that every human being seeks, we will also find our path of authentic service in the world. In my field, marriage and family therapy, we talk a lot about self of the therapist. What it means is like your self-development. We spend years in our career, but also it's a lifetime journey of understanding ourselves, growing ourselves, improving ourselves so that we can serve our clients as best as we can, because we are our only tool. And so when I came into working with physicians and medical students, and I say this with most respect to dear friends and colleagues, I was surprised that there wasn't as much self of the physician development as sort of an understood part of career development. And but what I found in working with colleagues and friends is that we all have this deep desire, right? This authenticity to be ourselves and this authenticity to serve the communities that we care so deeply about. And so so much of Palmer's writings talk about this sort of authenticity to ourselves, to others. And to continue on, I wanted to highlight, right, what we all know, whole person care. This is one of the greatest gifts that Loma Linda gave me, my 4 years here for my PhD and the 4 or 5 years working afterwards. So well over almost a decade with Loma Linda. And when we think of whole person care, I know it depends on what part of campus and what part of your community you're connected to, but we often think about patients. Right? How do we offer whole person care to our patient population, to our clients? And for today, for this little segment that I'm sharing, I wanted to shift us to thinking about whole person care of the care provider. Whether you are a physician, a faculty, a chaplain, a pastor, an administrator, what does whole person care of ourselves look like? From the example of working with physicians, these are some of the challenges that we know, not just from the research, but from our clinical encounters with physicians, right? We know physicians are no different than the average population in terms of encountering relational stress, right? So many of the resident physicians that we would see, it was not necessarily the hours they were working or the sleep deprivation, but it was, I'm having a really hard time with my spouse at home. Right? We aren't able to talk through all of the stress that we're enduring. How do I be a new parent? How am I caregiving for my parents as they're dealing with issues of immigration? Right? So it's relational stress that is affecting their well-being, thus affecting patient care. I won't go into all of these, but these were common issues that we saw in our office related to the stress that care providers were facing. And what I wanted to highlight here, I know the topic today is our social contextual selves. I'll get into that more in a moment, but what does that mean as it relates to this, right? We are not simply, and sorry, I have no idea why it keeps doing that, but we are not simply people without a social contextual identity. So for example, relational stress could be, well, the communication styles I learned at work are probably a bit more masculine inclined. It's not working at home with my wife, right? I can't talk to her the way I talk to my colleagues. Why is that not working for me? Or first generation physicians, the first in their families to go to college and grad school, right? Oftentimes face imposter syndrome. And so with that imposter syndrome and higher stress in the workplace, that is related to their social contextual identity as a first generation student and medical doctor. So our stress, our well-being is directly related to all these variables. And the flip is also true, right? Working with medical students who are third, fourth, fifth generation Adventist physicians, right? And then there's a pressure of, oh my gosh, if I don't perform well on this unit, like that person will then tell that person, and then so-and-so will find out, and then my parents will, lose face, whatever it is, right? So there's different kinds of pressures related to our contextual identities. So I'm grounding this whole person care of the provider within this context. Now, as we talk today about care provider congruence, right, this is our hope. This is not always and forever. We can experience life and career as present, being informed, connected. accepting of ourselves and others, and always humble. But this is our hope, right? As a community of Christ followers, as a community of people who share the same values, is that not only are we providing whole person care, we want to be attending to ourselves as whole people. I was briefly talking to Dr. Ma, and before I get to that, I wanted to mention relational ethics is something we talk about in marriage and family therapy. There are a number of theories and frameworks that talk about relational ethics. And this is sort of how I wanted to ground the conversation today. And so I'll just emphasize here that within the MFT field, relational ethics recognizes that relationships are intricate systems with interconnected members who influence and are influenced by one another. So these things are not just about individuals, but relational dynamics, power dynamics, cultural contexts, and social influences. And here's this last piece that we're highlighting today. Relational ethics also recognize the significance of self-care, self-awareness, and self-compassion within an ethical framework. So when we talk about relational ethics, right, this is about belonging to one another. It is not just duty to patients and not harming, but this is about care of ourselves because we are together as a community, and one generation's thriving benefits the next. And as we talk about this, these are the 4 pieces I'll mention here. So a little bit of the research on selfhood and patient care. We'll talk about what does self-awareness, knowledge of self look like, and then how to grow ourselves. And then lastly, the therapeutic use of self in clinical encounters. Right. So to your disappointment, this presentation is largely not going to be focused on any sort of systemic analysis of the research. There is a ton out there. I'm only highlighting a few key points related to physician selfhood. And I wanted to highlight, I call it self of the therapist. Dear colleague, Dr. Zane Yi brought up the term physician selfhood, which I think sounds good and it makes a lot of sense. So I've titled it Physician Selfhood and Patient Care. But one thing we know, physician occupational well-being may contribute to better treatment and positive experiences of patients. This is sort of a very obvious point. There's a ton of research that points to this, but this is not just physician occupational well-being. We know that any of our well-being in the workplace, if we are not burnt out, our patients, our clients will do better. Our full selves are more present, right? So I'm not going to belabor that point. The second piece, I wanted to highlight emotional intelligence. Right? There's a lot of definitions of this, but for the sake of today, this is identifying emotion in ourselves and others, using emotions to reason, understanding our emotions and managing them. All of this enhances patient care and safety, right? So I'm curious, right, in your training, whatever your field is, to what degree do you learn emotional intelligence, right? Identifying what are my emotional triggers? What are the things, the types of personality styles, communication patterns, patient behaviors that activate me and cause my emotional reactivity to go high? And how can I manage those in the moment? Right. So lots of emotional intelligence related conversations are helpful for not just physician selfhood, but all of our well-being. Number 3, providers' ability to deal with uncertainty, also known as uncertainty tolerance, at a cognitive, emotional, and ethical level has been shown to influence the diagnostic process with potential for diagnostic error and impact on patient outcomes. I think this one is fascinating because before I looked at the research, I think with our work with the medical students here, we were noticing through the pandemic that uncertainty tolerance was fairly low, right? what's going to happen next? My board exam just got canceled. Oh my goodness, if this is getting delayed, then what? It's a lot of, understandably, a lot of high anxiety because not a lot of knowledge about what to expect, right? The medical school trajectory, right, is fairly clear. You do certain things at a certain time frame. You need to jump through certain hoops. But if that shifts, then what happens to our internal state? And so there's growing research on uncertainty tolerance and how that can affect things like diagnosing things with error, and it affects patient outcomes. The last thing I wanted to highlight is implicit bias. And this is something I'm sure many of our institutions teach and talk about now. But in this particular study, this is implicit bias against BIPOC patients, Black, Indigenous, and people of color patients, that this is present among healthcare professionals, regardless of level of experience and specialty, right? And this understandably contributes to health disparities. It affects patient behavior and treatment decisions, among many other variables. So all of these topics are related to person of the provider, right? Person of the chaplain, the pastor, the professor, the dean, the physician, right? And I will also say the father, the mother, the parent, the family member, the sibling. So knowledge of self, right? There's a couple of things I wanted to talk about related to knowledge of self. And many of you, if you've done leadership training or human resource, whatever development for your groups, you might be familiar with personality assessments. Those are fairly common these days, or leadership and relational styles, right? There's the DISC, there's NeuroColor, there's all sorts of really great assessments, and they're wonderful. It's helpful to have those tools to understand who's the team you're working with. How do I understand what communication styles work best, right? There's also what I would say as a family therapist, understanding our family of origin issues, right? And dynamics. And so this is the family that we grew up with. What were our parents like, or the primary caregivers in our lives? And this is like a whole degree required for exploring family of origin, right? But I just have this list here for us to think about. If we haven't yet delved into these topics in depth, I would encourage us to do so, right? And many of you know, different seasons of life, we explore different aspects of our family of origin, right? So for a single person entering partnership or marriage, and then entering parenthood, entering, teenagers, launching your children, empty nesters, new issues from our family of origin surface. It's like, I didn't know that was part of my lived experience up until now. Why does your family do it this way, right? No, this way is the better way. So all of that to say, like, we need to look at those things. But for today, what I'm going to focus on is the social contextual identity, right? This is less talked about. How is my social contextual identity necessary for me to understand, to look at, to be part of my relational dynamics and part of my self-understanding? So I'm going to share two models that are helpful. And this is the wrong way. One is the addressing framework. So this is one acronym that is used to introduce us to various contextual identities. Within the United States, we often frame things around race and gender, and for good reason. Race is a very foundational social variable identity that shapes our experiences of ourselves and each other. But there are many, many more. And so I'm not going to go into depth with all of these, but you'll see, right, age and generational influence, disabilities, religion and spiritual orientation, so on and so forth. What is very common for all of us is that we function out of our own minoritized identities, right? Because they tend to show up in our relationships in terms of us feeling not so good, right? So I always give myself as an example. As an Asian American woman, this is what I experience the most in my day-to-day life. It's the first thing you probably see about me. And if anything, it might be the only things that you can see about me from the outside. If you are familiar with Asian American phenotypes, you will recognize that I fit that. If you're more familiar, you might recognize that I'm East Asian, right? And I am a stereotypically feminine presenting type of person, right? So, and it's true. And so my life every day, this is how I exist. And when I experience microaggressions, racism, it's usually related to one of these variables. A common one is anywhere I go, right? Like in the room right now, there's Dr. Wee and myself. If people are not familiar with us, they will confuse us for one another, despite us having different ethnic backgrounds, all kinds of differences. Everywhere I've worked, this has happened, right? It doesn't matter where, in a school, in a hospital, same story. The piece that was powerful to me when I was first an MFT professor at Cal State Northridge, when I used this model, I realized I have way more areas of being part of dominant culture than I do part of minoritized communities. And so when we look at this, right, I am of an age and generation. Typically, we say if you are contributing to society, you're productive, you are sort of valued by society, you're within what's acceptable and privileged, right? You can have a job, you can function, you can contribute to your family. That's age and generational influence. But as of now, I don't have any major disabilities. I have a Christian foundation and history in my family that makes me part of the majority within our United States. I have a higher socioeconomic status because of my educational status and my family's background. I am heterosexual. I do not have indigenous heritage and do not have generations of land stolen and all kinds of trauma. I am a citizen. That is something I learned that was huge because my husband is not. And so all the things I learned about living undocumented as an immigrant, the challenges of not being able to return to your country of origin and see your family, all of these things, right? So I share this with us because many of us kind of think about our minoritized identities for good reason. And I think we need to spend time understanding and unpacking that. But what are the ways that we have, centered dominant statuses within our various contexts? So this is one model. Another one is called the social graces. So yeah, I think it's sort of a funny one, but I love it. There's a lot more on there. I'll just read briefly. The G's stand for gender, geography. Then we have race, religion. We have age, ability, appearance. And then we have class and culture, ethnicity, education, employment, sexuality, sexual orientation, and spirituality. So there's so much more that you can do to use these if you're teaching and mentoring or using it for your personal lives. But I wanted to just at least give you these tools, right? Now, one of the ways that we can think about this is that there are both the visible and the invisible, and then the voiced and the unvoiced parts of our identities, right? So again, using myself as an example, right? Today, what's visible to you maybe is my race and my gender, and you can assume by me being invited to speak here, something about my education, right? That might be a bit more visible. But what is visible and maybe unvoiced, Dr. Wee did introduce some of my religious background, but appearance is an interesting one. So if you're familiar with colorism, right, the general idea, and it's this due to the global history of colonization, is that the closer you are to whiteness, the more status you have. Doesn't matter what country of origin you're from. And so this is the same in Asian countries, right? So I'm a lighter skinned Asian American. I have friends, I have family members who are darker skinned Asian Americans. And there's a different sort of experience in the world because of the color of my skin, how I appear. If I wore, a whole lot of jewelry, or if I dyed my hair a very different color that was sort of out of a general social norm of working at Loma Linda within the healthcare system, there are assumptions that people could have about me, right? And all of that is informed by each of our social contexts. And so there's also unvoiced and invisible things, right? This is sort of in flux, but like the possibility of chronic illness, right? You can't see that in someone. It's not visible, someone's abilities sometimes. What I could talk about, I'm Taiwanese, but that's not something you can necessarily assume by looking at me, right? And with being Taiwanese comes a whole history of, some immigration trauma from my parents, war and the threat of war to my country of origin, all these sorts of things. So I share this because this sort of XY axis is a helpful tool. Whenever we're in relationship, if you're in a clinical space with a patient or colleagues, we always want to ask, okay, well, these are the things that I can see. These are the contexts and variables that are being voiced. People are talking about, okay, we're having a conversation about gender, right? How maybe women have a different experience as third-year medical students. But what are the stories that are not being voiced? What are the experiences that I can't see that maybe I need to ask about and have a thoughtful and humble way of asking about it? So I wanted to just at least give this to us for a helpful tool. Now, there is, of course, that whole section was just general knowledge, right? Social contextual knowledge. Now I'm shifting into growth of self, right? So what does growth of self potentially look like? How do we do this? Well, we have this term we know, reflexivity, right? It's the process of reflecting on one's own beliefs, assumptions, and contexts, and how these shape our understanding and actions. So I hope, right, all of us, myself included, spend some time in reflexivity in our lives, right? And in a Christian context, this might mean in our devotional time, when we go on retreats, it's time away to really think about how am I doing in my life, right? And I talk about self-relational and contextual reflexivity. So what this is like self-reflexivity, relationship with myself, right? And then relational. How am I doing in my relationships, my partnerships, my parenting, grandparenting, my workplace environment? And then the contextual reflexivity is what is my relationship to my community, right? How am I understanding myself as it relates to the context that I live in? And so we want to and hope to engage growth of self within all of these contexts. And oftentimes I find in working with people over the years that our society encourages self-reflection, like what are your goals and dreams in 5 years, 10 years, right? But we don't necessarily ask, where do you want if you go to marriage seminar, maybe, where do you want your partnership or your marriage to be in 10 years, right? In 20 years? How do you want your relationship with your so-and-so to be, right? These are really a different level of reflexivity. But the contextual one, this could be varied depending on where you are. But for example, I think about myself, right? Being at Fuller Seminary now, this is the end of my first full year. What is my identity as an Asian American female colleague with my new set of colleagues? How do I contribute to that space? What are my areas of growth in that space, right? In my family, as my parents are aging, and we may have different, let's say, either political, religious, whatever kinds of views, but we still talk about being Taiwanese and sharing, grandchildren. How do I negotiate the context of being in my family as I understand, who I am, even as a therapist within my family, right? All of these identities are significant to us. So there's three things I wanted to talk about as important and critical for self-growth. One is reception to feedback. This is major, right? I remember my husband has been a public school educator for a long time, and he grew up with two brothers, and they all like to offer critical feedback to each other. And my sister and I, we only have girls in our family, don't do that. Everything is affirming. Oh, you did such a good job. That's great, right? So then when I have a presentation, my husband's checking, oh, can I see your presentation? Sure. He looks through, he's like, can I offer you feedback? So early on in our marriage is like, well, it depends how you give the feedback, right? So we all don't feel the best about feedback, and it depends who's giving it, how they're giving it. And I remember early on as an educator, when you get your course evals, same thing, right? When you open it and you read these comments, you're like, oh my gosh, that really hurts. That's offensive and it really hurts us. But now, like the other day, he took a look at some other slides and I'm good. I've learned how to take his feedback, take some things with a grain of salt. I'm like, well, in your educator hat, you don't understand this from a therapeutic perspective. Oh, but I'll take that piece about the design. I'll fix that part on the design, right? Same thing with our students, right? Understanding our students' feedback in context. So reception to feedback is huge. What avenues, formal or informal, do we have in our lives to really get feedback from our loved ones, from our colleagues, from our patients, from the mentees that you work with, students? The next piece is responding to influence. So some of you may know the names John and Julie Gottman, who've studied marital satisfaction for decades. And one of the variables they found that contributes to long-term marital satisfaction in heterosexual relationships is when the male partner is willing to receive influence from the female partner. What that means is that if the wife has an idea, oh, I really think that we should change this part of the backyard. Can we take out the deck and put this in instead, right? Receiving influence looks like, oh, that's an interesting idea. Let's talk about it more, right? I want to know why that's important to you and what are you thinking about, right? Not receiving influence would be, I don't think that's a good idea, right? Shutting it down, thinking that my opinion is better, maybe it costs too much money. I don't know why she's thinking about it. End of discussion, right? That is actually very true in many partnerships. That's what it sounds like. So, but responding to influence, what does this look like in your world? I'm going to get into this more in a few minutes. And then intentional change. How much time do we actually give to creating space for change in our lives? Do we create debriefing after a difficult meeting at work, right? Is there space to talk about it? Do you schedule time in your schedule to think about, the fight that you had with someone or a really rough faculty meeting, whatever it is? We need time to reflect on it and make a plan to do so. I probably don't have time to go into all of these, but looking at those three things, I want to talk about how do we respond to feedback, right? We need to know our triggers. We need to know what are our traumas, because that's going to show up. Finding the right time and space to give and receive feedback, right? If your spouse, when you come home from a really long shift and you're exhausted, they're like, can I tell you what happened with the kids? And can I tell you, why our son's upset with you? It's okay to say, I really want to hear that. Right now may not be the best time because I might not be in the best place to hear it, right? But I want to hear this maybe tomorrow morning after I wake up, right? So time and space is critical for when and how to receive feedback, managing our stress responses, and then, of course, practicing communication styles. How to receive and respond to influence, recognizing that someone else we love, we care about, that they have something important to them. We need to manage our ego strength, right? That's a huge one. Many of us, maybe in our workplaces, we have certain levels of power and influence, but maybe at home you feel like you have less so, or it's flipped, right? And so that affects your sense of self within varying spaces. And then, of course, relinquishing our desires for power, our need for control. This is a huge one for me. At work, I'm very chill, but at home, I'm in control of everything. When something goes wrong, mama is not having it, And so I know Dr. Wee said, I'm very composed at work. At home, I am not. So how do we receive influence? How do I receive influence from my 2 and my 5-year-old when they have something important to say to me, right? When I'm in a rush and ready to get them to school. And then lastly, do we schedule time for growth? This requires bandwidth. It requires space. Those of you who are not familiar with SMART goals, right? Specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time focused. Right? We want to have these sort of goals for our own personal lives and our own well-being. Investing in an executive coach or a therapist. This is really helpful. As a therapist, I've had therapists and have therapists in my life, right? I've sought out professional coaches as well. Where do we put our finances? Is it in these areas of growth? Is it in our relationships? Is it team building? Is it understanding social contextual issues for the team that we work with? Can we hire someone to come educate our teams about these things? So the last piece is this therapeutic use of self, right? How does this look? How can it look? When we think about a meaningful encounter, this could be with a patient, with someone you love, a colleague. When I think about a really meaningful encounter, these are 3 things that I think are present. One is validation, right? That all parties feel validated. Wow, you can see that, I'm having a really hard day, or that current event that just took place is really affecting me. And thank you for validating that, it's not unexpected for me to be feeling so upset about it, right? Clarity, right? That communication was clear. You're not left wondering, well, what did they mean? Did they really say that? Like, were they offended or not? Right? Those sort of unclear conversations are not therapeutic. They leave us feeling a little stressed, a little agitated. And then last is if there's visibility, truly being seen for who we are, right? Our gifts, our talents, our weaknesses, our areas of growth, that all of that is visible and accepted, right? And so, a side note, this is a picture of a dim sum platter. If anyone has gone to have, Cantonese dim sum. I share this because an often thing with certain families when you go eat is that you're serving each other. And you're noticing as the lazy Susan goes around the table that, oh, my mom over there does not have this dish. I will notice it and give it to her, right? And I don't know to what degree this is like a cultural norm, but this is sort of like in my family, and I know a lot of Asian families. So you're always observing the context and you're aware of what people need, oftentimes without it being said. And so visibility is sort of like this, right? It's knowing enough about the people you care about, your team, your patients, that you might reach out. You might ask a thoughtful question. And so these are some practical ideas, as we wrap up, right? I know you can probably guess this is just a little teaser. All of these concepts, ideas about authentic self-congruence to ourselves. The question is, how do we experience feeling validated? When and how do we experience clear communication and feeling seen by others? And how and when do we offer this to the people in our lives as well? And so I hope that you'll take the content from today and consider, right, how might I transpose that into my workplace, into my family environment, my personal world? So a reminder, the general who, right, is looking at ourselves, looking at our relationships, looking at our contexts. The what is the various types of knowledge that we can attain about ourselves, our personalities, our leadership styles, our social contextual identities, our family of origin, understanding relational dynamics. The what can also be, for those of you who are administrators or deans or leaders of other kinds, what are the systemic and structural changes that I can consider in my role related to congruence of self and being authentic, right? And the how. This is really important, right? This is not a one-time workshop and I figured out who I am and how I can be congruent for the rest of my life. We are always in growth. We are always developing, right? And so who are the partners, the team members that you want and trust to be with you on this journey of personal development, of relational development? How might you seek out accountability for this, right? For me, a critical thing is actually, I went on my first silent retreat this year, and I hope that I will keep doing that at least annually in my life. For me, it's having couples therapy with my spouse. That is a form of accountability in my personal life, and it transfers to my workplace. And then remembering that this is both a short and a long-term process. There are immediate fruits of our labor that will be visible, but there will be things that will take years and decades where you will see it show up, in your grandkids, in the future generations of mentees in your life. The image I want to end with is this labyrinth. I went to the Jesuit Retreat Center up in Los Altos in January. It was the first time I walked such a large labyrinth. There's one at our kids' school, Claremont Presbyterian Church, but it's small enough where you could see the whole thing while you're walking it. So it's like a different experience. But when I walked this labyrinth, it's huge enough where as you're going on the path, you cannot see the rest of the labyrinth. And so those of you who are familiar with the movement of a labyrinth, you move sort of closer to the center, and then it takes you further from the center and then closer again. But all the while you are moving closer to the center, right? And I really love this imagery because I think of Christ as the center, right? This longing we all have for wholeness, for authenticity and congruence. But the journey to get there, sometimes it doesn't feel like we're moving in that direction. Uncovering and dealing with family of origin issues, it can be dreadfully painful. That's why many of us avoid it, right? Looking at our trauma, at our triggers, why we react in the workplace to our patients in a certain way, that can be really uncomfortable. It's easier sort of to leave that. But as we do so, and we have the courage to do so, we're actually being kind to ourselves. I think we're being more congruent with ourselves. And by so doing, the fruit of that hard work, it shows up in our patient care, in our work with our colleagues. People can sense that groundedness that comes from it. And so I hope that there are pieces from my sharing with you today that are helpful and you find enlightening and applicable to your context. There are, of course, references here, but I wanted to leave it here if there are any comments or questions. I like this picture better, but yeah. Yes, thank you so much.
So Jessica, I'll go first. I really liked what you talked about, where we identify with our minority selves without perhaps understanding how much, maybe for lack of a better word, into privileged communities we actually fit into. Can you address this or talk about this a little bit more, and how this affects the way that we occur to others or how we perceive others occurring to us?
Sure. Yeah, what I want to say is that my belief is that God has put us in our context each of us with our beautifully created social contextual identities for God's great purposes, right? And so all of our identities are perfectly constructed. What happens as a result of where and how we grow up is that our social context shapes us, right? If I've never, and I grew up in an Asian American church, and I know this might sound strange to some of you, but I never met a non-Asian Christian until I got to Fuller Seminary, right, for my graduate degree. And so for me, I was like, oh, there's non-Asian Christians in the world. Like, this is interesting, right? And so it's been a journey since then. So the same goes for all sorts of, identities. But I think this is where Jesus's life of incarnational living, crossing all kinds of social contextual identities, right? Moving from one location to another, being with the least and the lost and the last of society, that there's something to be said about immersing and understanding things that were not familiar to us. Even if our upbringings were privileged, some of us, it was not. But I think regardless of where we come from, that there's an importance in understanding the different experiences of others, especially the most marginalized, if we don't know that. Having said that, when I've worked with medical students, especially the ones who are first generation medical students, oftentimes students of color, where there's a lot of imposter syndrome, a lot of invisibility. And what happens, to no one's intentional fault, is they're really left out of conversation, right? They don't know the social norms about how to communicate, how to interject. I'll speak for myself. When I was in my early 20s, in my first group supervision, I was the only Asian American in the group. I only had Asian American communication spaces at my home church and in my family. Now, here I am with a bunch of racially diverse but non-Asian people who are speaking over each other, right? It was fun. It was very lively. But I'm like, I don't know how to do this, because this is disrespectful for me to just step in at any point. And so I had to learn a different way of communicating and speak up and say, I would just raise my hand and wait for the supervisor to call me because I didn't know another option. So we have students like this. We will have patients who are coming from, let's say, communities of color, to maybe a white dominant healthcare environment. And they don't know, what are the social norms, right? What's appropriate for me to say or not say? So that's always, there's a term, allostatic load. It's what minoritized individuals accrue over time, the stress on our bodies that shows up to contribute to health disparities. So in our work environments, in our teaching, in our families, these are just things to be aware of. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what came to my mind.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions?
It strikes me that one of the most important and simplest ways that we can validate each other is to begin by asking, I think I heard you say this. Did I hear you correctly? Yesterday, I thought I heard someone in this group say something that I thought was completely wrong. And I really wanted to stand up and go, no, that's wrong. And then I realized, but I need to be sure that I heard correctly, because maybe I was preoccupied, a little bit distracted. I was looking at the video, maybe not hearing quite right. So to me, your comment about validation is very important, and how we validate each other is so easy if we take the time to ask first, did I hear you correctly? So thank you.
Yes. Thank you. Yes, that is so true. And I really appreciate your modeling of cultural humility and just really excellent active listening skills, right? And so thank you. Really appreciate that.
So my question has to do with the idea of an authentic self. Right now, a lot of your Jessica, your presentation has talked about the hybridities of our identities and the complications, the code switching we have to engage in. And sometimes when students come to me to talk about, their own lives and their own journeys, oftentimes I hear things like, I don't really know who I am, as a result of having to cross so many bridges, have to build those bridges, right? And I myself struggle with that too, because I'm an immigrant myself, and I had to learn a new language coming to the United States, and not really knowing where I actually fit culturally, or what social norm should I embody. One of the provocative things said in that original quote that I was referring to is that you should try to be authentic, and I'm butchering it, I know, even if that means that you might break the rules or something like that, even if it's not something that is accepted around you. But what if we don't really know what that even is, right? What I'm trying to be true to, and what are some of the guidance that one might provide in cases like that?
I so appreciate that question. Last week, Fuller, this month is Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. It's also Mental Health Awareness Month, right? It's a significant month in my line of work. Last week, Fuller had a series of talks highlighting South Asian mental health experts, theologians, pastors, and we had several questions from students and people in the audience very similar to this, right? International student from India sharing, like, I feel like I don't belong anywhere. When I return to India, the level of education I have, I stick out. And then when I come here, my accent, I just don't feel like I have a place. Who am I? And this is not, I know, a very satisfactory answer, but and I have often felt like that. I had a therapist once who told me to read Flannery O'Connor's Displaced Person, right? Feeling displaced all the time. I think there is a reality that this is part of our human existence. And how do we, not to oversimplify, like in terms of a Christian identity, see both the beautiful social contextual self God has made me to be, and also cling to the fact that I am beloved of God, right? Those things are not shifting, but my context is always shifting. And so I think oftentimes, this is my framework of doing therapy, is how do we empower people to critique, understand their context and how it contributes to that sense of displacement, as opposed to you are forever displaced because you don't belong anywhere, but rather because of societal discourses and expectations and the ways that things should or shouldn't be, we end up feeling like we don't belong, right? The more and more times people mistake me for another Asian American woman, or think I'm one of their Asian American students or something, like, to me, I've dealt with that. Like, I understand, like, there's a whole reason why that kind of racialization happens. But to someone who has not understood the effects of racialization on an Asian American person, that can be really disempowering. And they can leave a space and feel like, I don't belong here. No one knows me. I'm invisible, right? As opposed to saying, you know what? I need to show up even more and speak up to make myself visible. So I know that's not giving a clear answer, but I think on this side of heaven, I think there is something to say about wrestling with that tension, understanding that oftentimes there's not a clear resolution, but how do we still value ourselves, who we are to God and our community, even while doing so? Yeah.
Jessica, thank you so much for your presentation. I was very impressed by your authenticity And how I would suggest, and then I'll come back to a question regarding what I'm suggesting, and that is that you have read the American experience so well and so insightfully, and you have learned from it in what comes across as a critical way and appropriated that so that you can share freely with us about your own experience and come across making yourself supposedly vulnerable to us because you're sharing some things about your family life as it compares to how you act in the office. You're getting therapy yourself with your husband. I mean, all of this would not be typical of many people who would present from that platform. And so I guess I could stop right now, but I want to turn this into a question, and that is to say, do you accept the idea that I suggested early on that you've read the American experience in the way that you have, and that implies that the sort of thing that you're doing in being so authentic is relative. It's relative to time and place.
Yeah, thank you. That is such a profound question. And I appreciate your observations. Side note, in my field, this is not that uncommon. So I understand when I shift to healthcare, I've had many physicians say this to me, but within groups of therapists and psychologists, fairly normal. Can you say more about authentic to time and place? Is there a piece that you're thinking about, or in terms of like my presentation that you're clinging to? Because I'd love to understand it.
No, I'm not so much asking that question because of your presentation. Well, maybe I am, because it does seem to me that you are, as I was saying, reading what some might say the woke version of what it means to be authentic today in the United States. And I've read enough history and studied enough religion and philosophy to know that that the idea of what it means to be authentic and real varies.
I see. Yes.
So does that help?
Yes, that does help. I appreciate that. I don't know if this is a roundabout way of answering your question. My mother had a job interview last week, and she wanted to talk to me about how should I answer this question about what are my areas of growth and my weaknesses, right? And as someone who studies and teaches racialization, especially of Asian Americans, I hear in my mother's experience a lot of the model minority stereotype that she has fulfilled and lived out. And it does contribute quite a bit to her anxiety, right? And so when people tell my mom, oh, you're so compliant, right? My mom has thought that was a good thing, but now she's thinking maybe it's a bad thing to be compliant, right? And if I were asked that question in a job interview, you would hear all these things I'm saying right now, right? But I talked to my mom knowing her generation, her level of awareness, who she is as a person. I did not think it is helpful for her to talk about issues of race in that context. That is not authentic to who she is, right? It is not part of her conscious awareness. It is not the right time and place for me to have that conversation with my mother. I don't know if that kind of gets at your question, but as a clinician, we talk about client-directed therapy, right? Patient-centered care. Always thinking about where are people as they are. I know I'm teaching and offering language from my educator hat, right? And that's what all this content is. But depending on who I am with, I shift my language, right? If I'm working with a group of Asian American pastors, I do not use language that turns people off or confuses them. I think that is unhelpful, right? But as a larger arc, I do think moving toward community and wholeness, whatever authenticity looks like to you, congruence, those are traits that we should all move toward. Does it look the same for everyone? Absolutely not. So I don't know if that kind of touches a little bit of what you're wondering. Yeah, my pleasure.
So someplace in Corinthians, don't remember the exact passage, Paul, in a reflective moment, says, by the grace of God, I am what I am. So if I come to see you for therapy and I sit down on the chair and say, by the grace of God, I am what I am, how will you respond?
Sure. Well, believe it or not, this came up in my household this week, right? In my household, we navigate challenges around neurodiversity. And my husband said, well, what if this is just the way that I am, right? And I said, sure. And it's wonderful because God made you that way. At the same time, it contributes to challenges in our home, right? So how can we address the challenges? And this is assuming like I am what I am is not about like abusive behavior, right? Power and control issues, but rather like personality traits, brain functioning, whatever the case, right? If as someone who works with clients who live with severe mental illness for a lifetime, some of it, they're simply managing symptoms day to day, right? This is their existence. And so what does it mean to, yes, be who we are as God has made us to be, but are there ways where in our flesh, in our relationships, we can still improve them, make life a little more joyful, right? A little less painful. And so we have tools for like supporting my son who was very active, right? How do I teach him or model things for him? How do we support family members who are living with depression or anxiety? And so I don't know if there's so many things we could talk about in terms of I am who I am. I don't know what type of am you're talking about, but that's the first thing that came to my mind. Yeah.
So I'm toying with two ideas and I would love your feedback on them. One is the idea that there isn't a self to find. There is only a self to craft. So like with this comment, I'm crafting something about myself. And in another comment, I could craft it in a different way. Is it possible that it's that fluid? That's the first question. The second is about belonging. We're looking often for a place to belong. It's like a human endeavor. And I ran across a survey that talked about a belongingness score, meaning, is it possible that we carry belongingness in ourselves? And so that I'm asking myself, am I a place where I belong? Am I a place where others belong? So those are two ideas that I'd love your.
I love those ideas, and I would love to just like sit and talk for a while, but I can't because in a few minutes I have to leave to pick up my kids. One thing is the self to find and the self to discover, was it? To create. I think of this as both and I know there are probably many perspectives to approach this with, and I'm approaching this from differing levels of people's capacity to connect with themselves, whatever that means, right? So one of the tools I use as a clinician is something called havening. And a lot of it's a trauma intervention. We use it a lot with the physicians over the last few years. But there's one piece where along that process, you can ask someone, okay, what are you noticing in your body, right? Some people will very quickly say, oh, I feel this tingling in my head, or this like dark, heavy feeling in my stomach. It's like this, right? But there are also people where it's a blank, and it's the connection between like head space and inner space is simply different. I don't think it's better or worse, but with that clinical experience, I think it's both and. I think there's a piece of myself. I feel like I'm needing to connect to myself and find that resonates with my framework and my brain and my personality. But I know there are a lot of people, and I'm thinking along the lines of neurodiversity, especially, where creating self seems more congruent with who they could be, as opposed to, oh my gosh, trying to find myself is so stressful, right? Some people will feel that way because they don't have like a sense of interoception or other tools. So that's one piece. Remind me what your second thing was. Oh, belongingness. Belongingness. The one thing that came to my mind as you were speaking is, in a lot of collectivist cultures, it is hard to think of belongingness as to myself, right? There are certain family structures or communities where belongingness will always be with the other. And to the point where almost negation of self. And this is not necessarily like a bad thing. It just simply is. And so I'm thinking about that and what is useful for our North American context. So again, I just think it depends on the person, the context, our social contextual selves. I want to say thank you for all these really thoughtful questions and comments. I appreciate it. Yeah.
So thank you so much, Jessica. What a wonderful thing to end on, a very deep and profound reflection on what does it mean for us to be ourselves, our identity, right? How do we know what to do without knowing who we are and what we stand for, which is why I find it's so valuable for us to be here. Again, I want to thank all of you for sticking with us till the end. Give yourself a round of applause. First and foremost, this conference wouldn't be possible at all without the help of our superstar staff, Jacqueline Camarena from the School of Religion.
Thank you, Jackie.
And collaborating with Jackie, Sarah Cabral sitting in the back, Maggie Armini, who is not here with us. All deserve a very big thank you from all of us, as well as the yummy food created by the team led by Greg Sullivan with Loma Linda University Catering. Hope you've enjoyed the food over the weekend.
Yeah. And of course, support from our dean, Dr. Razelin. So he's actually helping us try to troubleshoot another issue. But yes, just want to really acknowledge his support, and we're really deeply grateful to that.
And of course, always, if Dr. Jerry Winslow didn't do the groundwork of building and bringing together the partners of the Adventist Bioethics Consortium, we wouldn't be here sitting here today. So thank you, Jerry.
Thank you.
Thank you to you too as well. Yeah. Thank you.